Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're going to walk through my strategy for doing next solos. We'll be doing the range only method in this video, which means that we needed to teleport and head back in every kill, so it will be beneficial for you to have access to the max guild portal, or at the very bare minimum, the God Wars Dungeon teleport so you can get back more quickly. In order to make sure that we're not wasting time between kills, we should also set up two presets ahead of time, one for actually entering the next prison and one for the kills themselves. The mandatory items for the entering the prison preset would simply be ancient ceremonial robes as well as the frozen key. I also like to include some of the things that I use when setting up for the hour the first time, a few logs to bonfire, a Shadow Nihil pouch to summon a familiar, as well as wax to extend my aura. As far as the second preset for the actual kill, most of what you'll be wearing is simply your best in slot DPS gear for ranged. Any ranged weapons will also work, but the Noxious Longbow is actually a little bit more effective for Nex because of its extended range. Nex has incredibly high defense, so you'll want to be using a Reaper necklace, and in the pocket slot you can use either a Scrimshaw of Cruelty or a Godbook. In your inventory you'll mostly want standard things like the Enhanced Excalibur, your ring switches, food, a few Ceradomin brews and Super Restore flasks, an Overload, an Adrenaline potion of some kind, and a Prayer Renewal potion of some kind. You'll also want an anti-poison, as Nex has a small chance to poison you on the first phase, or alternatively you could include that in your entering the prison preset and simply sip a dose before you enter the encounter every time. You'll also need either a shield or a shield bow switch, both for the use of defensive abilities and also to build adrenaline at the very beginning of the fight, something that we'll talk about shortly. You can also bring a tier 70 plus defender for the chance to get an ancient emblem drop, or simply use that as a substitute for your shield switch. Last but not least, you'll want a small stack of magic note papers, as Nex has a very common chance to drop a big pile of unnoted Ceradomin brews and Super Restore flasks, which can be quite valuable, and not claiming these using the note papers will cut into your profits quite significantly. In terms of armor perks, everything here is going to be pretty standard for high-level PVM, but in particular you want to make sure that you have your Crackling 3 paired with Mobile. On the Shadow phase, it's extremely important that we stay outside of Nex's melee distance to avoid a very powerful bleed damage, and having the abilities Surge and Escape available twice as frequently can help fix mistakes if we end up making them. If you do have this perk combination on one of your pieces of armor, however, leave it unequipped in your preset. We'll be using either Surge or Escape to build Adrenaline at the very beginning of the fight, and we can simply equip that piece of armor after we do so. In terms of auras, the general guidelines apply, where Reckless should be your first choice, followed by Sharpshooter, followed by your less obvious choices like the 5% Magrat aura or Dark Magic. Given how far Reckless outclasses the DPS of the other auras though, after having done an hour on Reckless you likely will never have interest in doing next solos with a different aura ever again. Finally, the last element of gearing before we actually get started is to take a quick vacation over to the Glacier Cave and get the passive Stone of Jazz buff that gives us a small DPS increase in the next encounter. Now we're finally ready to get started with the kill. We'll need to be using an instance, as the combination of the instance and the tactic of teleporting out and re-entering every time is what allows us to use range for every kill. There's no need to stall adrenaline between kills, as we get to build some right at the beginning of the fight before Nex becomes attackable. Shortly after we jump down, she begins her animation where she rotates around the room and summons her minions. When Fuma spawns in the corner just to the left of the entrance, despite not being attackable we can target him. After doing that, we'll want to sip an adrenaline potion and use these 5 abilities to get ourselves to around the 70% adrenaline mark. Make sure you re-equip your piece of equipment that had Mobile on it, and always use Anticipation last, as this effect will carry over and help block one of Nex's special attacks on the first phase. This is called the Smoke phase, and let's quickly take a run through the basics. Throughout this phase we'll be using the Deflect Magic Prayer, and Nex has 2 primary special attacks as well as a passive special attack. The primary special attacks on this phase will alternate back and forth with a period of auto-attacking in between, and the passive special attack can happen at any time. The first special attack, Let the Virus Flow Through You, is simply a stat drain which we're going to completely ignore since we're using overloads. During the second special attack, when Nex says there is no escape, she will teleport to one of the ends of the cross that comprise the center of the arena and surge across. This hits any players standing inside this area for high typeless damage and disables their prayer, however can also be effectively ignored by simply luring Nex outside of the central part of the arena. This leaves us with the only special attack of any consequence, her passive special, for which you'll get a chat notification that says Nex draws you in, and you'll be brought into melee distance of Nex. Your protection prayers will be disabled, and you'll be stunned for a short period of time. This is entirely blocked if you have Anticipation active, which is why we wanted to use it last when we were building Adrenaline off of Fumus. You can also clear the stun with Freedom, however that's likely to be on cooldown as we use that to build Adrenaline as well. In truth, it should be relatively rare that you actually encounter this special attack, and when you do so, there's really not much you can do about it apart from eating the damage for a short time and resuming the fight afterward. So, with all that in mind, let's take a quick run through of a typical smoke phase. We'll be starting the phase from right outside the cross near the entrance to the arena. I like to begin the fight with Shadow Tendrils as this guarantees that you also get a two-hander auto attack without any kind of stalling. After that I'll use Snapshot and Fragmentation Shot and run back towards the entrance to pull Nex outside of the area and also double the bleed damage. At this point, Nex often starts trying to melee you, however we can exploit this to actually make the phase significantly easier. When she does this, we're going to start running back and forth through this area. Nex's pathing doesn't work all that well in this confined space, making it difficult for her to hit you, therefore stalling her regular attacks and slowing down the progression of her special attack rotation. This stalling method makes it easy to get Nex to 160,000 HP, the point at which Fumus becomes attackable before she uses her second special attack and becomes temporarily invulnerable, thus extending the fight unnecessarily. When she does hit 160k HP and says Fumus don't fail me, we refocus our attention to killing Fumus. In fact, each of the first 4 phases of the fight is going to culminate in us defeating one of Nex's minions, and they have some interesting mechanics on their own. Each of these minions only has 10,000 HP, so at first glance you may think that it'll only take a hit or two to kill them, however they also have something called a soft cap of 1,000 damage. Basically what this means is that for any individual hit splat, any damage in excess of 1,000 damage is going to be dramatically reduced. Because of this, any ability which spreads its damage over multiple hits, such as Rapid Fire or the Bleed basic abilities, are going to be dramatically more effective than single large damage hits like Snipe. Nex herself also has a soft damage cap, however it's significantly less punishing on the first few phases where it appears to be around the realm of 8,000 damage. This gets a little bit more harsh in the final phase of the fight, but we'll discuss that when we get there. For now, just keep in mind that when you're dealing with the minions, you either want to be using Rapid Fire, which on its own will be enough to take out an entire minion, or use a combination of both of your basic bleed abilities. In any case, once Fumus is dead and we tag Nex, we begin the second phase. This is called the Shadow phase, and it's the first phase where things tend to start to get a bit tricky, so let's take a quick look through the basics. First things first, this is the only phase where Nex switches to using ranged attacks, so we're going to swap to the Deflect ranged prayer. She also only has 2 special attacks on this phase, but which one she uses first depends on which special she used last on phase 1. 99% of the time, the last special she uses on phase 1 is going to be There Is No Escape, and so she'll start Shadow phase with a Fear the Shadow special attack. When she does this, she places a black circle underneath the player, and if they don't move off it within a second or two, it explodes, dealing very high typeless damage. These are honestly quite easy to avoid, and you should have no trouble doing so, especially after you get a few kills under your belt and you'll start to develop an intuitive feeling for when the next one will be coming. Her second special attack, Embrace Darkness, is actually only done once, and doesn't have any direct tangible effect apart from making the room appear a bit darker. What this special attack indicates is that anytime after this point, if you're standing in melee distance of Nex, you'll suffer a very severe bleed damage. This can be a bit troublesome because if your magic defense is higher than your melee defense, which will be the case when you're using ranged armor, Nex is going to often force herself into melee distance as she tries to melee you. You can circumvent this issue by bringing enough melee armor switches to change the corresponding defense numbers so that she doesn't ever try to melee distance you. However, this is not recommended because it dramatically reduces your accuracy during this phase. Instead, the best thing to do is to take advantage of the fact that Nex is trying to melee you and run her in a similar fashion to what we did on the smoke phase. By doing this, we can delay the onset of her Embrace Darkness special attack long enough to mostly deal with the phase before the bleed damage is even possible. After that point, our focus will shift to making sure that we stay outside of melee distance through a combination of running and the use of either Surge or Escape, which will be beneficially influenced by our mobile perk, and just generally doing whatever necessary to make sure we stay outside of melee distance while we finish the phase and kill Umbra, her second minion. Keep in mind that when Nex is trying to force melee distance on you, after a short period of time of being unable to hit you with a melee attack due to you fleeing, she will temporarily stop and switch to using her ranged attacks and quit chasing you. With all that in mind, let's take a look through a typical Shadow phase. As I said previously, we'll probably be starting this phase after the No Escape special. If this is the case, after we tag Nex, we can actually soul split for a short time before we switch to our Deflect range prayer. When the phase starts in this way, she'll use a Fear the Shadow special before her Embrace Darkness special, and then another Fear the Shadow special before ever doing an auto attack. As you can see, Nex was already trying to force melee distance with me, and so I used that opportunity to run her for a period of time and stall those special attacks. Throughout this time, I'm literally just spamming threshold abilities until Nex hits 120,000 HP and Umbra becomes attackable. If at any time during this phase something has gone very wrong and you're stuck in melee distance with Nex and need to put some space between you and her, one of the easiest ways to do this is to remember that you can actually surge across some of the dead space in the cross in the center of the arena. After you've done this, Nex is obviously going to chase you down one of these two bridges, but provided that you run in the opposite direction, you'll guarantee that enough time has passed that it will reset her melee attack attempt and she'll begin ranging you at least for a short time. In any case, once Umbra is attackable, we'll deal with him in the same fashion that we did with Fumus and proceed with Phase 3. This is the Blood phase, and if anything, this will be the phase that decides whether or not you're going to be successful at doing Nex solos. The basics of this phase are quite simple, and everything centers around healing Nex in some way, so this phase entirely boils down to basically a DPS race to make sure that we're out-damaging all of Nex's various forms of healing. Firstly, Nex is back to using magic attacks, and she will continue to do so for the rest of the fight, so we'll swap back to the Deflect Magic Prayer and it will stay that way for the remainder of the kill. For Nex's first special attack, she says a Siphon will solve this, summons 2 Blood Reavers, and performs a short animation, during which any damage against Nex is going to heal her instead of damaging her. Initially, these Blood Reavers don't serve a purpose, but if Nex is allowed to use the Siphon special for a second time, these first set of 2 Blood Reavers are killed and she heals any HP that they had. This shouldn't be an issue, however, as we're going to talk about a strategy for making sure that we get it done in 1 Siphon every time. For her second special attack, Nex says, "I demand a blood sacrifice," and the player will turn bright red temporarily. They then have a short time to get outside the attack range of this special attack, which appears to be about 5 or 6 tiles, and if they don't manage to do so, they take 10% of their maximum HP in damage, as well as healing Nex by 100% of their maximum HP. Generally speaking, if you're using the attack rotation that we're going to talk about shortly, the phase should end right before she uses this special attack, but if for any reason she hasn't been killed at this point, all you have to do to avoid this special attack and avoid healing Nex from it is to surge away from her. She also has 2 simple passive specials on this phase, the first being that any bleed ability is going to heal her instead of damaging her, so throughout this entire phase we will not be using Corruption Shot or Fragmentation Shot. This tends to work out just fine as it gives you the opportunity to use it on the minion before and after the blood phase anyway. She also uses blood magic throughout the phase, which means she heals a little bit from her magic auto attacks, however the amount is totally negligible. So with all that in mind, let's take a quick look through the full blood phase rotation, and we're going to start with a very sneaky trick right after we kill Umbra. This is technically before we've even started the blood phase, and after we kill Umbra we're going to stall for just a moment. This is to make sure that when we retarget Nex, we fire an auto attack, and as soon as we see that auto attack animation happening, we want to use Snapshot. The timing on this is easy if you're facing away from Nex, so when you target her again, you face towards her and you activate Snapshot immediately as you see your character turning. Basically, the goal here is for that auto attack to actually phase Nex into the blood phase, and then Snapshot is going to deal all of its damage before she's even able to do her Siphon special. This technique is called pre-phasing, and although it can be done on any phase, it's only really important on the blood phase because she starts right away with a Siphon special and heals from damage. After that pre-phase, we'll want to switch to using a non-damaging ability like Anticipate because Nex is going to Siphon. After the Anticipate, we want to use Snipe, but we want to time it so the damage actually goes through right as Siphon is ending, and the timing for this is to activate the ability right as Nex is transitioning from her crouched position into her upright position as part of the Siphon animation. After the Snipe, we'll immediately use Onslaught, and 99 times out of 100 this is enough to get Nex to 80,000 HP and allow Cruor to become attackable to end the phase before she even uses her Blood Sacrifice special. If for any reason not enough damage goes through, you can simply avoid the Blood Sacrifice special and finish Nex with a couple of basics, being sure to avoid your 2 bleed abilities. Similarly, if you don't have the Adrenaline or the HP to use Onslaught, you can simply do Thresholds instead and do this phase quite easily, however you may want to focus more on running Nex to stall her special attacks in that case. Either way, we'll finish Cruor off with our double bleed abilities, and then we'll tag Nex into phase 4. This is the Ice phase, and it's another one that tends to be just a little bit tricky. The basics of the Ice phase are again quite simple, but there is at least one special that can get you killed if you're not prepared. As we said earlier, we will continue to be praying Deflect Magic through this phase, but this is slightly amplified in importance because her passive special on this phase is that her auto attacks will bind you if you don't have the Deflect Magic prayer up. Generally speaking, when we phase into the Ice phase, we want the last special attack that Nex used on the Blood phase to be the Blood Sacrifice special. If this is the case, then the first special she starts with on the Ice phase is the Contain This special. A few seconds after she says Contain This, icicles will explode in melee distance around Nex, dealing damage to any players standing there, stunning and binding them, and turning off their protection prayers. There's a small secondary part to this special attack where a small icicle will try to slowly chase down the player and deal a very inconsequential amount of damage, but this can more or less be ignored. This special attack should be very easy to avoid and only really presents any kind of danger if Nex happens to be attempting to force her way into melee distance when she uses it, in which case you may need to use Surge or Escape in order to put enough distance between you and Nex to avoid the special. Her second special attack on this phase is the Die Now in a Prison of Ice special, although this will be used first if the last special she used on the Blood phase was the Blood Siphon. Very shortly after she says this, the player is entirely surrounded by icicles, their prayer gets turned off, and they get stunned for a short time. Shortly after that, this deals a huge amount of typeless damage to the player, and initially this special attack was designed so that another teammate would free you from this prison by breaking one of the icicles, but since we're solo, we need to come up with a different plan for dealing with it. Instead, we'll be anticipating ahead of time to make sure that we aren't stunned and fully vulnerable while the prison is active. We can't actually attack Nex while inside the prison, so instead we can use Reprisal assuming we've unlocked it, and that will recoil the prison damage back on Nex afterward. Having Reprisal isn't entirely necessary for Nex solos, but it does make kills more consistent and smooth. We'll also want to do a shield switch for Resonance and Preparation, not only to build Adrenaline, but also because you're going to get an auto attack from Nex, either a magic hit or a melee hit, either on top of or right after the ice prison ends, while your prayer is still disabled, and this gives you the opportunity to heal back a significant amount of that lost HP. This is the tricky special to deal with, as if you get a second ice prison and don't get a sufficient amount of stalling Nex in between by running her while she attempts to melee you, you won't have resonance available to do this heal method again, and so the combination of the ice prison damage and the auto attack can be a KO. For this reason, it's super important that we focus on stalling Nex's attacks by running her when she attempts to melee distance to make sure that the ice phase only includes one cycle of her special attacks. This is also why our objective should be to phase into the ice phase after the Blood Sacrifice special, so that if the phase for some reason goes a little bit long, the extra special attack is another Contain rather than a second ice prison. In any case, apart from the very specific rotation we use for the ice prisons themselves, pretty much every part of ice phase is going to be improvised depending on whether or not Nex decides to force melee distance and gives you the opportunity to stall. Only use rapid fire if and when Nex is not chasing you, and try to maximize the amount of time that you're running her, simply spamming out as many high damage abilities as possible. When she hits 40,000 HP, the last minion becomes attackable, kill it the same way that we have the others, while continuing to avoid specials or run Nex if necessary, and then tag Nex to begin the fifth and final phase. This is called the Zeros phase, and it is effectively Nex's final stand against the player. Nex has no actual special attacks on this phase, only passive effects, but they do have a pretty strong impact on the way that we're going to deal with this phase. As for the basics, to start with, we're going to continue using the Deflect Magic Prayer, as her max hit with magic has increased very dramatically and she'll hit in excess of 2500 damage through prayer, so keep an eye on your HP at all times. She also gains a big chunk of HP at the beginning of the phase, but this does nothing apart from extending the length of the phase. She also uses a handful of new prayers on this phase, although they don't impact the fight too much. The first is Turmoil, which does precisely what it would with the player, increasing her stats, making her more accurate, higher damage, as well as more difficult to hit on. The second is Soul Split, and anytime she's using this prayer, all of her successful hits against the player heal her for 2,500 life points. This prayer is the primary reason we're going to continue kiting and running Nex around the room as much as possible, despite the fact that she doesn't have any primary special attacks on this phase. The last new prayer is Deflect Melee, which of course means absolutely nothing, being that we're using ranged. Finally, the most important thing is that Nex's soft cap has been reduced to 2000 damage for the rest of the fight. This means our ability rotation against Nex is going to start looking much more reminiscent of the ability rotations we were using on the minions previously in the fight. Usually our goal will be to start the phase off with our really strong multi-hit abilities like Rapid Fire and Snapshot, as well as using our Double Bleed and then building back to Deadshot, a very rarely used ultimate ability. Deadshot's damage is separated into multiple hits, which again helps us bypass that soft damage cap and deals better damage than things like Onslaught or Death Swiftness would contribute. After that, our goal would be to build back up to use Rapid Fire and Snapshot again, while filling in as necessary with basic abilities to build Adrenaline, all the while running Nex as much as possible to mitigate damage and also prevent the healing from her Soul Split. As one final cherry on top to this encounter, Nex will switch to the Wrath Prayer right as you kill her, so make sure you move a few spaces away from the spot where she died to make sure she doesn't kill you after her death with the Wrath damage. All in all, this should be the easiest of all the phases, and using these techniques I tend to average about 3-minute kills plus or minus 15 seconds depending on how often Nex decides she wants to force melee distance with you and allow you to stall her. I think those are good times considering how casual and consistent this method is, opting out of things like Vuln switching on Blood as well as Wyvern Crossbow switching on the minions. Massive thanks to Wumpry as always for his generous support on Patreon that helps make these videos more frequent and of much higher quality. I hope this video helps you guys learn or improve your next solos, and I'll see you in the next one.